Good morning. This is that one day a year where I have to be more exciting than a car show right outside. We'll try. I don't know. The first lesson today comes from the book of 1 Samuel, and it's where the elders of the nation of Israel gather together with Samuel, and they ask him for a king. Prior to this time, Israel did not have a king. They were a loose confederation of 12 tribes that only banded together as one when there was something major going on, something bad going on. And it was usually when there was a warring nation that was coming in and threatening them. Then one leader would rise up. That leader was usually called a judge. And then that judge would unite all of the people and they would go and take care of the threat. And then when the threat was over, the judge went away. And certainly the judge's, firstborn son didn't take over. It was ad hoc leadership when it was absolutely necessary. But now Israel wants a king. They want someone who will rule permanently. They want a dynasty. And part of the reason they want this is for the security that comes with having a king and a standing army and a united 12 tribes at all times. But 1 Samuel tells us twice in this lesson the real reason that they wanted it. They wanted a king because all the other nations had kings. If they have kings, why can't we have a king? We like palaces and crowns and thrones and all the pomp and ceremony that comes with having a king. That sounds like fun. We would like that too. In this, I totally get where the Israelites are coming from. I remember when I was like a tween, and then when I became like a young teenager, the one thought that motivated me every single day, the one thing I wanted more than anything was just to fit in. I didn't want to stand out at all. I just wanted to fit in with everyone else, because if you stood out, then you were a target for whoever might say something for you. So I wanted to look like all the other kids, and I wanted to dress like all the other kids, and I wanted my shoes to be like all the other kids' shoes. I wanted my hair to be like the hair of everybody else. I wanted my backpack to be like everyone's backpack. I wanted my He-Man lunchbox to be like everyone else's He-Man lunchbox. If you had a He-Man lunchbox, you know. I just wanted to fit in. And here, Israel just wants to fit in. The problem is that this is not what God wanted for the people. God was perfectly happy with the system they had, with the ad hoc judge that would arise every once in a while. He was perfectly happy with a confederation of tribes that existed independently until they had to come together as one. Part of that, theologically, was because God didn't want the nation of Israel to be united under a king. He wanted the nation of Israel to be united under him. And a king would sort of displace God from having that central role. And so Samuel goes off and converses with God and tells God, look, the people want a king. And then God tells him what to say. And Samuel goes back to the leaders of the 12 tribes, and he says, this is not going to go as you think it is. He says, your sons are going to be taken from you, and they're going to be conscripted into the king's army. And your daughters are going to be taken from you, and they're going to be conscripted into his palace service. and all that grain that your fields and crops are producing, 10% of it is going to be taxed to the king. And oh, do you have sheep, and do you have horses, and do you have mules? Because 10% of those are also going to go off to the king. He says, you will be like slaves to this king. Remember, the Israelites had not all that long prior been slaves to another king, Pharaoh in Egypt. And God's like, you're going to do it again. And the Israelites say, sign us up. We are willing to pay that price. You want 10%? Absolutely. You want our sons and daughters? Absolutely. Such was the desire to just fit in that they went with that instead of what God wanted for them. And it's not like there was an altruistic thought underneath, like they really wanted to be like all the other nations, because all the other nations were full of really great people who were doing really moral and upstanding things, and they were really caring for the vulnerable among them and taking care of it. No. Don't be silly. They wanted the power that came from having a king, not the power that came from being united under God, but the power that came with being a king. And for that power, they gave it all up. Our gospel lesson is very different. This morning we find Jesus in the 3rd chapter of Mark. This is very early on in his ministry. Most of the 1st chapter is taken up with introducing Jesus and introducing John the Baptist and Jesus getting baptized and Jesus going off into the wilderness and Jesus calling the first disciples. It's really not until the 2nd chapter that you really start seeing Jesus out doing his ministry, and this reading only comes from the middle of the 3rd chapter. So we're like a chapter and a half into Jesus' ministry. And we have not had a lot of teaching up to this point. There's been a short teaching on Sabbath because Jesus keeps healing on the Sabbath and people start challenging him. There's been a short teaching on fasting, but pretty much everything else Jesus has been busy doing is healing people. He goes into a place and all manner of humanity just rise up and want to be healed. And such masses of people come and gather around him that Mark says the disciples didn't even have time or space to eat. And so Jesus is in a town, the place is packed, they don't have time or place to eat. But then comes on the scene his family. And they have come because they've gotten word that Jesus has gotten big and he's getting a following, and people are starting to say that he is out of his mind. They've started to say he's crazy, he's wild, he's weird. Best case scenario, they've come to kind of rescue him. And maybe they're worried that this way of life is not going to lead to anywhere good. More likely, I think, they are embarrassed of him. Because Jesus is not just fitting in. He is not just doing what everyone else does. He's not just wearing the same thing and the same shoes and the same haircut and the same lunchbox. He's not just doing what everyone else does. And people start saying he's crazy, and I think his family is like, we have to rein him in. This is embarrassing. And then we find the Pharisees, saying something similar. They're saying, well, he has Beelzebul. The father of demons is in him. And that's how he's doing all this healing and casting out of evil. And then after the little teaching that he gives there, we see his family show up again. Jesus is in a house, and people are so packed in that his family can't get into the house. And so they're outside trying to get in. They send word, tell Jesus his family's here. And then someone in the crowd in the house are like, hey, Jesus, your family's here. The people who think you're nuts. The people who are trying to restrain you, who are trying to hold you down, to tone it down, to stop doing all of this stuff. They're here to take you. And that's when Jesus says, who is my family? It's not just those guys. Anyone who does the will of God gets to be my family. Jesus, unlike the Israelites, is not just trying to fit in. And Jesus, unlike the Israelites, is not trying to just amass power and influence for himself. Because he's not hanging out with the popular people. He's not hanging out with the people who have the money and the influence and the popularity. He's hanging out with the people who are desperate and hurting and sick and hopeless. Those are the people who go running out of their house and who crowd into Jesus because they need him so much. He is not doing this for himself. He's there for them. He's there not just currying favor with the important people. He is there to be with and minister to the least, the lost, and the last. In these two stories, we have two very different ways. We see the Israelites just trying to fit in and trying to fit in to raise their stature and to gain power and security and all of that. And the other way is we see Jesus doing the exact opposite, standing out by standing up for those who are most vulnerable in society. Two ways. And although this story took place almost 2,000 years ago, these two ways are every bit as available to us today. This is one of those lessons where you go, oh, Bible times weren't that different from ours. The number of people today who are just trying to fit in, the number of people today who are just trying to amass influence and power for themselves, every bit as much as 2,000 years ago. And the people who utterly give of themselves for others and for the least, the lost, and the last are still called crazy and nuts and weird. And so these two ways are our options. Do we go with the ancient Israelites or do we go with Jesus? Do we go and just fit in or do we stand up for the least, the last, and the lost? What are you going to do today? Which way will you choose? Who do you know that needs love and healing and grace and forgiveness and mercy? And will you sit down with them as Jesus did and still does? Amen.